why is it important to formulate, our responses to questions in such a way? So the first one, for example, is using frameworks, right? We've all talked about looking at a situation from situation, complication, action, results, right? And it's been called different things, but the idea is to break down a question into 4 segments. Is like, you're telling me the situation is like this, the complication happened such that there were new market entrants or something happened with the organizational design, leaders left, and here are the actions that were taken, here are the results. And you can use these to answer their questions or to explain your situation about what you've done, right? So your achievements, your accomplishments on the resume, they might ask you about that. So you break it down for them. Don't assume that they've read your resume or your CV or even your executive biography. Don't assume any of that. You just go in there with a fresh face and say, listen, I'm here because enough of my resume was appealing to them such that they called me in. Now I'm going to walk them through how I actually, resolve some of the business situations that I was leading through. Okay. Prepare a safety net example. So this is always an important one when you're thinking about networking, right? Not just interviewing, but networking has really got the element of don't get caught off guard, right? And the way to not get caught off guard is by having some preparation material in your back pocket, things that you can always fall back on if you're sort of backed into a corner and you're forced to think about an element where maybe you're just blanking out, right? You're not really sure about how you showed about digital transformation and went from A to Z, but you know that you've done something similar before. These safety net examples are very helpful, right? So these are basically 2 or 3 most significant encompassing success stories in your career. These are success stories that you're proud of, right? That you have the metrics like right off the bat, if you were to say, here was the outcome, and just be ready to talk about those, because as you're talking about those examples, the answer to the question you're trying to think about will come to your mind. It'll just come. That's how we get out of brownouts. That's how we get out of blankouts, right? Is by just start talking truth about what you've done, and some of the responses that you want to provide to that question they asked you will come to your mind. And you're ideally utilizing them to demonstrate, a wide range of skills, right? So you might want to make sure that includes communication, leadership, analytics, the outcomes of what happened. And they can also be fallback responses, right? If you need to buy some time, and we all do sometimes, to think of a better answer or another example. And you want to practice these so they become second nature. You don't have to search very hard in your mind to kind of just come right out and say, well, here was the example that I gave, as I led, as a executive VP like 2 roles ago. Here was the situation that we had. And oh, by the way, here's the response to the question that you asked earlier on, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Safety net examples are great to have, especially when you're meeting someone for the first time at a networking event. Here's a couple more. Know your unique selling point. So if you're able to communicate, go back to the example of shopping, right? If you're able to communicate through your product very clearly without a whole lot of description about why it is that product is the right product, then for sure you're going to be able to make a significant influence and be able to help the buyer make a decision. What's the unique value proposition of that product, right? It's got to be something that hits the mark for what the purchaser, the buyer needs. So if you know your value proposition and you know what market needs to hit as far as that organization goes, or in that market to help them be more competitive, then it becomes very easy to answer a lot of their questions, because you keep pounding back to, this is what I'm unique at. This is the value that I bring. This is that missing puzzle piece that you have that I can fill, right? And that'll make your responses not only more rich, but also more convincing, right? Because that's who you are. You're telling your story. Create rapport. So there's a concept that maybe some of you heard of, which is mirroring, right? And I would also say pacing. So mirroring means that you want to use language that's similar to what the interviewer is talking about. So if they're talking very technical, kind of hard edge questions, and the vocabulary they're using are pretty much, hard edge vocabulary, you kind of want to mimic that a little bit to kind of relate to them and make sure that they understand that you're tracking with them, right? And there's 3 kind of representational systems that, this is a more theoretical, but this is important to know, right? There's a visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And basically what that means is there are some people who talk about, I didn't understand that, or I didn't see that. Please help me visualize that, right? Please help me understand that through the way that I see things, right? Some people will speak as if, I didn't hear that very clearly. Could you please repeat yourself, right? And so if they want you to repeat yourself, then make sure that it's an auditory kind of conversation that you're having, right? So be descriptive is what I'm saying. Kinesthetic are things that are more specific to, for example, like, what did you specifically do in this situation, right? So it's an action kind of conversation where you want to talk about like your achievements, accomplishments, and it's not just about what they see, what they hear, but it's what the outcome is. So you want to listen carefully to the interviewer. You want to create rapport. The way you do that is you kind of try to mirror them, both in pace and also in content. So if they're speaking slower, you don't want to speak very quickly, right? If they're speaking very quickly, you don't want to take too much time, right? So hopefully these are effective and you can relate to them. The fifth one really is using your language to guide the interview. And oftentimes we don't realize that as we're speaking that there's a storyline that's building in the mind of the listener. You're basically piecing together for them a story from beginning to end. And if you lose them along the way, their story crumbles and all of a sudden they lose interest, right? You can use your language to influence or to kind of steer the interviewer in the direction you want them to. So anticipating a logical conversation, right, is a good example. So you might say, I know you're wondering how I can use my experiences in turning around in underperforming companies on the brink of closure, et cetera, et cetera. Because after you have a conversation about, your competency around turnaround, you might say, I know you're wondering, right? And so therefore, here's the example. Giving a reason with because, right? So humans are always looking for the meaning of things, right? So you've got two comments there, right? One, which is I always achieve my targets. And the other one is I always achieve my targets because I have 3 years of experience. So of course, the second one is better than the first. You're allocating, attributing the reason behind your success. And it goes back to the very basics of resume writing and executive biography, which is you can't just talk about the what, right? You've got to talk about the so what, and the so what happened first because of the fact that you did the what, right? And that's what the because kind of links together. And that's the conversation that you can have as you guide the interviewer. Gaining the interviewer's compliance. Now, this is maybe a little bit controversial, but what I mean by that is you're trying to get them to the point where you're guiding them towards what's important. You're a human highlighter. So let me just give you 2 examples there, right? So one is you can see from my resume how much experience I have, etc. Can't you, right? And it's kind of saying, listen, I want you to look at my resume now, and I want you to see something, and can you see it or not, right? And so gaining that sort of the compliance of is sort of saying, I'm going to take control of this interview for a second, right? And in fact, it's a dialogue. So I have equal kind of contribution to this conversation, but can't you see this, right? Can't you see that on my resume? It says that. What about the second one? You're probably interested in how I achieved X, aren't you? Well, let me explain, right? And we speak like that to everyday language, right? When we're trying to convince someone, remember I was saying effective interview is like influencing someone in a positive way, right? So by highlighting what you want them to focus on, you're basically taking control of the interview for that moment at least, and kind of helping them to guide them along about what they should focus on, all right? So again, if you have any questions about any of these, effective ways of responding to questions, please drop them in Q&A below. There's already many of them actually that are accumulating, so we'll go back to them after the conversation here, the presentation. And then just some final interview preparation tips, right? So this is more of the preparation phase, right? So you want to prepare yourself mentally for the interview. Interviews are never pleasant, even if they're short or if they're full day, right? But do your research and conduct due diligence, right? This is maybe a seemingly obvious, and especially if you're looking for a role, maybe in a competitive company, you might just make the assumption that, oh, you've known them for so long, you compete against them on this dimension, right? So I don't really need to do a lot of research on them, but that's not always the case. So you want to do your research on, trends, larger social impact, and what's going to happen in the market, on people, right? The executives, the leaders, changes in recent org structure are very important. Look up as much information as you can about your interviewers, right? Context is key. And then make full use of their public statement and reports, what they publish out there most recently, and what their concerns tend to be, right? And you can kind of see patterns of that as you listen to them more and more deliver these presentations and these reports. News, discussion forums, existing and past employees, all those are fair game to prepare yourself for the mental game, right, of the interview. And what would I need to know if I was already an employee, right? So these are kind of questions around, if I was already in the role, what would I need to know, right? What would I need to know about like the way that things are in the organization and how they work? So mental preparation is very critical. Technically speaking, this is probably an obvious one, right? One of the things that I ask my clients to do is to do an inventory map. What that really means is you've got a job description, or a nominating committee has told you about what these specific things you have to do are, and you map that basically against what your resume tells you about your experience. So when you do a heat map, what happens is you kind of say, well, here are the areas that I have a lot of experience in what they've asked me to do, but here's some gaps, okay? When they've asked me to do X and I haven't really done X, okay, now I have some homework to do, right? How do I patch that up and make sure that I can show them that I haven't done X, but I have the qualities. I've got the foundation to do X, very effectively. So that's what a heat map is. Inventory mapping is taking what your skills are and overlaying that with what the job description says and seeing what the commonalities and deltas are. And when you find a delta, do something about that, right? Do some research around. Maybe you might want to do a quick kind of rundown of a white paper, right? To kind of understand at least what those gaps are. Okay, but anyway, you can go on forever for this. And the last thing really is around preparation is preparing yourself practically, right? Because first impressions matter the most. So you want to dress and behave appropriately. Executives don't really have a problem with that too much, but the first impression does, as far as how you come across, right? And again, the empathy, humility, all of those things matter when it comes to body language. And be wearing a body language there. Having a practice buddy is always helpful. So if you got someone before that, a fellow executive or colleague that can kind of mimic or kind of give you those questions in advance, you're preparing for the interview, and that's a practical way of getting yourself, your mindset in the game. And practicing is just absolutely important. A lot of what we do at the Executive Career Services team in BlueSteps is really just drilling. We drill our clients over and over again with what we have decided to be our important questions for that role. And that's different for every role, right? So a client might call me 2 days before an interview saying, this is a completely different role, but I'm wondering what they're going to ask me, right? So practicing is important. And, feel free to work with our coaches on that, because we do a spectacular job on drilling and practicing.